I never told my second husband that I owned two rental properties free and clear. Not when we were dating. Not when he proposed. Not even on our wedding day. And looking back now, at 64 years old, sitting in my kitchen with my morning coffee going cold beside me, I know that silence was the smartest thing I ever did. His name was Douglas. He came into my life the way a lot of things do when you're past 60, quietly, through someone else. My neighbor Connie invited us both to her retirement party, and he was charming the way certain men are charming when they've had practice at it. Good hair still, broad shoulders that hadn't entirely given up. He laughed at the right moments and listened when I talked, which, after 22 years with my late husband Jean, felt like being handed a glass of water after a very long walk. Jean had passed 4 years before I met Douglas. Lung cancer. 13 months from diagnosis to the end, and I was with him for all of it. When he died, I thought that was it for me. Not in a dramatic way. Just, I had been half of something, and now I was a whole thing on my own, and I wasn't sure how to be that yet. But I figured it out. That's the part people don't always see. I had worked alongside Gene for most of our marriage, bookkeeping for his small contracting business. When he died, I took those skills, that discipline, and I started paying attention to things I'd always meant to look at more carefully. I refinanced our house in Tucson. I read everything I could about real estate investment. 14 months after Jean's funeral, I used a portion of what he'd left me, money we'd saved together over decades, carefully, paycheck by paycheck, to buy a small rental property across town. A 3-bedroom ranch house that needed new flooring and a coat of paint and not much else. I fixed it up myself where I could, hired out what I couldn't. By the time I met Douglas, I had that one rented out to a nice family, and I had just closed on a second, a duplex about 8 miles from my house, both units occupied. I wasn't wealthy, I want to be clear about that, but I was stable. I had income coming in every month that had nothing to do with my Social Security check. I owned 3 properties outright, my home included, with no mortgage on any of them. That was the product of 20 years of careful living and 4 years of even more careful attention. I was proud of it, in the quiet way you're proud of things you built when nobody was watching. I didn't tell Douglas any of this for a reason. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I was playing games. But because Jane, God rest him, had told me something once, early in our marriage. He said, "Agnes, you'll know you found the right person when what you have doesn't change how they treat you." I had never needed to test that with Jean. I was testing it now. So when Douglas asked me about my finances, I kept it vague. I said I'd been comfortable since Jean passed, that I owned my home, that I had some retirement savings. All of that was technically true. I just didn't mention the rental income. I didn't mention the second house or the duplex. When he saw my car, a reliable but not flashy 4-year-old Buick, he didn't ask questions. When he came to my house for dinner, he saw a nice home in a quiet neighborhood, modestly furnished, nothing that would make someone's eyes light up. His eyes lit up anyway, eventually, just not for the reasons I would have hoped. We dated for 11 months. He was attentive for most of it, though there were moments, small ones I filed away the way you file away things you're not ready to look at directly. He made an offhand comment once about women who keep financial secrets from their partners, and I smiled and said nothing. Another time, he mentioned that his daughter Renee had expensive taste in a tone that seemed like the beginning of a sentence that never quite finished. I noticed that he never offered to pay for dinner without a pause, just slightly too long before he reached for his wallet. I talked to my attorney before I agreed to marry him. I want to say that clearly, because the top comment on my neighbor's daughter's YouTube video, she showed it to me once, this channel that tells stories like mine, someone asked why women don't do background checks before they get in this deep. I did mine. I just didn't call it that. Her name is Joyce, my attorney. I've known her for 12 years. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything about Douglas, about what I owned, about the rental properties, and I asked her to help me set it up right. We drafted a prenuptial agreement, which Douglas signed without much protest, though he did read it twice, and ask one question about the rental properties that I answered honestly but briefly. And we restructured the title on both rentals so they were held in a trust I'd set up for my daughter from my first marriage, my daughter Meg. The house I lived in remained in my name alone. Douglas knew I had property, he just didn't know how much. And after he signed the prenup, I thought, all right, maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe Jean would have laughed at me. We got married at the Tucson Botanical Garden on a Saturday in October. My daughter Meg was there, my son-in-law, my two grandchildren in their good shoes, squirming through the ceremony. It was small, and it was nice, and for about 6 weeks after it, it was fine. Then Renee arrived. Douglas's daughter was 38 and lived in Phoenix. She visited for Thanksgiving and stayed for 10 days. She was pleasant enough at the table, but had a way of looking around a room that reminded me of someone taking inventory. She complimented my kitchen, then asked how old the appliances were. She admired the backyard, then asked if I'd thought about what the property might be worth now, with the market the way it was. I answered politely and didn't volunteer anything. After she left, things began to shift in ways that were hard to name at first. Douglas started asking questions about my finances that felt less like curiosity and more like surveying. How much were the utilities on a house this size? Did I have a financial advisor? Had I thought about consolidating accounts now that we were married? I said things like, I manage fine and I'll think about it. I watched. Then one evening in February he came home and told me he'd run into some trouble with a business investment. Something vague about a partnership he'd been in, and a sum of money that was suddenly needed, and a timeline that was unfortunately very short. $30,000. He said it carefully, the way you say something you've been rehearsing. He said he hated to ask. He said he'd pay it back within the year. I told him I'd need to look at my accounts and get back to him. I called Joyce the next morning. She wasn't surprised, that also wasn't surprising. What she told me was that in the 4 months since our wedding, Douglas had made 2 inquiries, through a cousin who apparently worked in real estate, attempting to identify properties held in my name in Pima County. He had found my house. He had not found the rentals because they were in the trust. I sat with that information for a long moment. How do you know this? I asked her. Because I've been watching, she said. That's what you paid me to do. I thought about Jean. I thought about 14 months of watching him get smaller and quieter, and finally still. I thought about all the mornings I woke up after he was gone, and made coffee for one, and sat at this same kitchen table, and wondered if I would ever stop feeling like half a person. I had not done all of that and rebuilt all of that to hand it to someone who'd been counting it before he'd even kissed me good night. I didn't say anything to Douglas that week. I kept things normal. I made dinner. I watched television beside him in the evenings. Inside, I was making decisions. Renee came back in March, unannounced this time, on a Wednesday afternoon. I was home. She seemed surprised by that, which told me something. She said she was just passing through from Phoenix, which is a 3-hour drive, not something you do accidentally. She had coffee. She was warmer than usual, which also told me something. Then she said, carefully, that she'd been thinking about her father's situation and wondering if I might be willing to help. Not as a loan this time, as a gift. She said the word family several times. I said I appreciated her concern for her father and that Douglas and I would talk. After she left, I called my daughter. Meg is not Joyce. She's not an attorney. She's a middle school art teacher. But she is the person who knows me best in the world, and she has her father's instincts, which were good. She came over that same evening and sat at my kitchen table and listened to all of it. Then she said, Mom, what are you waiting for? I wasn't waiting. I was timing. The following week, I sat Douglas down at that table, and I told him I'd been thinking about his request. He looked hopeful in a way that made me feel tired and a little sad. Not for myself, but for the version of him I'd wanted to believe in during those 11 months. Then I told him I'd spoken to my attorney. His expression changed. I told him that I was aware of the inquiries made into my property holdings. I told him that the prenuptial agreement we'd both signed was fully enforceable. I told him that the two rental properties he had not located were held in trust and were not marital assets under Arizona law. I told him that I had documentation of the inquiry and that my attorney had advised me of my options and that I would be filing for divorce. He started to speak and I let him. He said things about trust and communication and how this wasn't what he'd intended. He said Renee had overstepped. He said he'd had no idea about the property inquiry, which I did not believe for a second, but also didn't argue. By the end of it, he was not angry. He was deflated, the way people get when something they thought was going to work simply hasn't. What I remember most is that I wasn't shaking. I had expected to be shaking, but I'd had months of knowing by then, and the conversation itself felt like something I'd already lived through. The divorce was finalized 7 months later. Under the prenuptial agreement, Douglas left with what he'd brought in, which, it turned out, was not much. No hidden accounts, no property. His car was leased. I felt something when I learned that, and I'm still not entirely sure what to call it. Not pity, not satisfaction, something in between. Renee sent me a text message the week the paperwork went through. It said she hoped I was proud of myself. I read it once and put my phone down. I'm in my kitchen again now. The coffee is still warm this time. Outside, the Arizona light is doing what it does in early morning, turning everything gold at the edges, a little unreal, a little beautiful. My tenant in the ranch house paid on time this month, same as always. The duplex had a small plumbing issue last week, and I had it handled within 24 hours because I have a plumber I trust and a reserve fund that exists for exactly that purpose. My daughter called yesterday and talked for 45 minutes about her students and her garden and a casserole she's been trying to perfect. I listened to the whole thing. I still have my home. I still have my properties. I still have my independence, which took me years to build and which I am not sorry at all for protecting. Jean was right. You know the right person when what you have doesn't change how they treat you. Douglas failed that test quietly, in the dark, before he ever thought I was looking. But I was looking. I have always been looking, and I am not as easy to take from as some people seem to think.